and by Facebook. This is Pastor Doug Jones at Elevation North here in Owatonna, Minnesota, where we're going through the book of Enoch. I would advise you, if you just tuned in today, and this is the first broadcast that you got, go back to the very beginning and listen to the first part, because it will help you understand it a little bit better and why we're studying the book of Enoch. But also, if you want the material or the book that we're using, we would be more than happy to share with you and help you to get that and whatever. If you want the notes that we have from the previous weeks that we have been doing this Bible study, well, you could just let us know on YouTube or write us to Box 200. That's pretty simple here in Owatonna, and we will be sure to get you in the news. If you've been reading along, I think that chapter 7 is a little bit easier to understand. What I started to do is I read your book that you have, which is just the book of Enoch. I read it first, and by the time I got all the way through, I was totally confused. It's really much more difficult. One of the things that you have to realize with Enoch is he is my kind of writer. He writes bullets. And it's just statement, statement, statement. It doesn't worry about having enough adjectives and adverbs and everything to make a complete sentence. He just shoots it out in bullets. That's the way I like to read things. I like the Reader's Digest book. I was just telling Jerry here that I just read a book, Is Your God Too Small? And you want to talk about an intellectual. He's got some, not only $50 million words in there, he's got some $100 million words. It really makes you stop and think about what our God really is. And he writes in long sentences. And boy, that was tough reading for me, because I'm not used to reading long sentences. And but Enoch, that's why it's difficult for you to understand Enoch and what it's going through. And so I'm going to break it down for you. One of the things we do, remember, is I will lecture here for about 40 minutes, and then we will open it up for any questions that you might have at that point. I want you also to know that when we're done tonight, that in which I'm going to talk about in the notes that I have made, Debbie has them typed up and will be handing them to you at the end, so that you can take those home with you. I'm not going to give them to you early, because you're going to be reading them instead of listening, so that works out that way. Okay, we're going to chapter 7, and when he starts verse 1, he's referring to the angels back in chapter 6, and what is happening here is these group of angels, and one of the things that we find that Enoch does is that he lets us know that the people, or the angels that came, they're divided in groups of 10, 50, and 100. And so the list at the end of chapter 5 is the main leaders of all of the angels that came back. And one of the things is we find that obviously that happened, which is really interesting. You know, one of the things I stop and I try to think about is we think that today is becoming more liberal, things will be creeping into the church. Here's angels that were living in heaven with all the splendors of glory, and I think it's interesting that they weren't satisfied even there. And so they left, and what we find is they introduced all kinds of things, charms, spells, medicine, ointments. You know, one of the things that bothers me is that is somewhat sneaking into the church today. And we disguise it, and we need to be very, very careful in regards to spells or anointments and all of these. I'm not talking about health anointments. I'm talking about, you know, certain things that you got to come. There are no spells, and there are none of this stuff. That's not from God, and we need to run away from it as fast as we can. And so what happens is these group of angels come back, and they get to the daughters of the human beings, and of course they become pregnant, and they grow these huge giants, which answers the question, which you got to realize realize in Genesis there's only 6 verses that talk about Enoch, and it's just kind of slid in there just before Noah comes to the scene. And yet we see all these pictures of inside of caves and all kinds of other things where they got these really tall people and then these really small people alongside of them. Well, here's the age in which we see that took place, because these people are tall. Some of them are, we're talking up to 50 stories tall, and so that's why we see what we didn't understand from some of the artifacts and things that they're uncovering today, that we could understand, and how did we put those into how do we fit them in, especially to the Bible, to make it all fit together in our 6,000 to 7,000 years of existence. The other thing that's interesting is that when he talks about there, he's talking about not only is there the giants that are born, they're bearing children, and they're even greater and taller. And so it's actually a repeat of what is coming. And also what is happening is not only are they children, they grow up and they have kids, it's the whole thing is degeneration from the very beginning. The problem is when you get to, can you imagine being mom and you got to cook for 5 of those boys? Oh, by the way, I found out yesterday, when you are sitting at the table, don't ever worry about Thanksgiving that minutes are a problem to your diet. It's all to do in seconds. And if you get that figured out, why, you'll understand. But the happening is what would normally happen is we've got huge appetites now that we have to somehow. Now, the world wasn't as big as it is now, so we didn't have worldwide. We had a small space in which they lived. And so what happened is all the birds are disappearing. All the animals are disappearing. All the fish are disappearing. Everything is disappearing. All the plant life is disappearing. And when that happens, they start eating people. And they start drinking the blood, because they're going to have to survive in one way or another. The problem we have with sin is it never goes better. Sin will always go deeper and deeper. Jerry is involved, and I've been involved, and we've both been involved for quite a while with alcoholics and drug addicts. And one of the things is they got to hit the bottom and get there until they realize that something bigger than themselves is going to change. When you come in and you're going to not have any essence, they left God, and because they left God, God's Spirit isn't with them, period. They are left to do whatever they will. And it eventually became worse and worse. And if sin is condoned, it'll always be worse the next step. That's why I always say that if you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. There has to be something that you're going to have to believe in and to hold the line. Now, chapter 8 is very interesting, because as he comes in, there's only 6 verses in chapter 7. Chapter 8, he then comes in and he talks about all the things that are going to happen. Weapon, jewelry, makeup. When I grew up in this very fundamental church, makeup was just, And if you grew up in my denomination, there was a fellow that became the very first international speaker. And he had what was called revival time. At 9 o'clock on Sunday night, he had no church, but at 9 o'clock on Sunday night, he had a place where he would gather. He had a choir there, and all the people would come in from all kinds of churches, and they would listen to him preach. And then that would go out worldwide. He was the very first one that got sermons were going worldwide. C.M. Ward was the most interesting guy that you could ever listen to, except when he was in person. C.M. Ward would get on a story on the story on the story on the story and never get back to where he started from. But knowledge that he had. But when he was on radio, and he had that X amount of time that he was to be on radio, he had to follow a script because it had to be okayed back in those days before it could even be broadcasted in other places. And one of the interesting things is why I bring that up is when I was in college, in seminary, makeup was the big thing. And so here's this C.M. Ward coming to our college to speak for a week. And he had question and answer, and they asked him, C.M., is makeup terrible? Is it a sin? And I'll never forget his answer, because he stroked his chin for a little while, and he says, you know what? If an old barn needs painting, you paint it. That was his answer. Get it over with. The problem is what was happening here, and if you look at some of history, what it has to say, it was the gaudy makeup that was being done, and the all the kinds of things that were happening, which is really strange because you go to Turkey now, and all the Muslim ladies over there, they all have fancy jewelry, makeup, and hair down to their waist that isn't in a turban. It's none of that. It's entirely different. Here, when he's talking about makeup, it's just, we get to draw lines and we pick little things that, oh man, I'm better because I don't. It's simply that it was being used for extreme makeover to really, you could, well, we see it when it comes out at Halloween and other times. Some people, I don't know, I saw a lady the other day, I don't know how she sleeps, her eyelashes were out at least an inch and a half. And it's just like, I don't know, I was getting tired just watching her blink. I don't know if I could take that, you know. But if you're drawing, if it's drawing unto yourself, and people are looking at it, Josh and I had the experience today. This lady got offended because I was reading her message on her t-shirt. And then when she finally realized that I was reading the message, I'm crabby today, and it's because of my husband, is what it said. But she got all mad because I was reading her shirt. And it's like, if you're wearing things and doing things that's drawing attention unto yourself, then you need to be looking at it and see what it is. They became more ungodly, which, interesting that in 2 Timothy, Paul says the very same thing, that in the last days in which we're seeing today, they are going to invent ways to be evil. A guy has got a court case now. I can't even believe that a lawyer took the case, but there's a court case now because the guy wants to marry his dog. He wants it to be official. Well, I'm saying if that's the best you can come up with, well, I'm sorry. But you see are you following what our logic becomes? One guy is filing a lawsuit because he's going to marry 2 sisters. And he wants to have that legal. And to be, we move it until finally it becomes more than what we can handle. They had, again, he talks about in verse 3, they used roots for plants for worship to get the right smell. Do all of those kinds of things because we get into astrology, which in other words are action. Interesting with astrology is that they move according to the moon. Did you know you can buy the moon? It's $1. It's 4 quarters. That's all it costs. But the whole thing is that people will move according to what the moon is. And I can tell you this, that if you work in Alzheimer's people, when it's a full moon, it's terrible. Oh, yeah. They have an action that comes out, and it's really strange. But when I know people that claim to be Christians, and they won't move until they can read the astrology for that day. Oh my goodness. You know what? You can read all 12 of the astrology for the day, and you guess what? It fits for every one of them. Can fit in there. It's not that it's one special one. Then in verse 4, we finally find the cries reaching to heaven. 2 cries that are really happening here is the cry of the devastation that is happening to those that are holy. But it's also now we're seeing the angels are going to go into action. And they begin to cry out in regards to what is taking place. Pretty much all of chapter 8. It's just really coming off of chapter 6. We're coming off of the list of the angels that were in charge of the groups, and then we go into chapter 7. We begin to see what begins to take place. Then we see in chapter 8 of how it grows worse and what they were doing and all the spells and all of the kinds of things that they were going through and so forth and so on. Now, when we get to chapter 9, it's interesting that he lists 4 archangels here. Now, in the Bible, folks, we only have 3 angels that are listed by name. They are Michael, they are Gabriel, and they are Lucifer. That's the only angels that have names given in the Bible. Now, here it's interesting that he gives us 7 names of angels that were taking part. And when you read through that, and you'll get them a little bit later, you were going to see that a little bit more of this when we get to chapter 20. There's 6 here, and then there's 1 more later. I'm going to give you the 7 that he talks about, and the particular meaning of which all of these angels have. They each have a specific duty. Michael, of course, is one of the great archangels, and he is responsible for, and his team of angels that he is in charge of, to watch over God's chosen people. That's his job. His name, Michael, means who is like God. And my grandmother used to say, she'd get after me, and she goes, that middle name is Michael. That means you're supposed to be like God. Well, whatever. I don't think that was part of my parents thinking of that. And if it was, man, they missed the boat by a long ways. But he was the guardian, Michael, one of the main archangels of the Old Testament. The other one, of course, is Gabriel, which his name actually means man of God. And he was in charge of the garden. When Adam and Eve got kicked out, Gabriel sat at the entrance so nobody could get back into the Garden of Eden. He's in charge of the cherubims. He's also the protective angel that does the protecting. And everybody, you need to understand, folks, there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of angels. Okay? And these 7 archangels that are listed that we find that Enoch lists aren't the only 7 in heaven doing everything. Each of those has their area of which they're over. And when I was looking at this and thinking about Gabriel's, being the angel that protects, I can just see the angels when I get up in the morning going, really? We got to go with that guy today? One of the things is that I'm a firm believer is you got to pray ahead. You want God's protection, not after the accident. You want it ahead of the accident. You want it ahead. We as the church have become a reactionary prayer group. We get the prayer chains or whatever, and we're praying for everything that's already happened. I wonder how many times we pray in the morning and say, God, protect me today. God, lead me today. God, direct me today. Yeah, probably never. And even if we do pray it, are we listening? But God, which is interesting, when we get to the ending, God knew what was going to happen. He did it anyway. We are not puppets. We are given self-choice, free will. And we can do what we want. We're not going to, it's going to happen. But there are things that happen in our lives that, boy, we need God's protection. And it's very important. And then I'm getting into these Hebrew names that we'll let Josh... Cyril, is that it? Or Cyril? Cyril. Okay, there you have it. Same as Raphael, that's the same name. He's the guards of, his group is the guards of the spirit of man. So, that little spirit, I'm going to do a sermon for you guys a little bit later that I want you to understand. We say, and you heard me talk about this a couple of weeks ago in the morning service, we talk about our conscience being the Holy Spirit. And that's not all true. Because you can grow up as a vegetarian in a vegetarian home. And all of a sudden meat's served and you go, I can't eat that. That's not the Holy Spirit talking. Are you following me? There are things that we learn by our background and where we lived and things that have happened in our life that we sense this is the way it is to be. That's not the Holy Spirit talking. That's our conscience because of what? Now, God's Spirit does work, and He does speak to our minds and so forth. But we got to learn how to separate that out. We need to learn that just because I was raised not to eat meat on Friday, and you know, I always smile because I was in that age group where my Catholic school friends go, "Oh, we can eat meat on Friday. What happened?" I'm not Catholic, I don't know, but I can tell you this: the Pope said you can eat meat on Fridays, except during Lent. But that was the law of the church. So for them to eat meat on Friday was something that bothered their conscience. That's not the Holy Spirit talking. Okay? Now, we go to the next one. Uriel? He's the angel. I love this guy. This is my kind of angel. He's in charge of the thundering and shaking of the world. Man, that's what I'd like to do. If I'm going to have a job in heaven, I want to make noise. I want to make a difference. And this guy is in charge with his angels that are under him to make sure. That's where earthquake, you know, we always say there's a crack in the earth. Well, there's things that just happen that they can't explain. How come all of a sudden in this part of the country there hasn't been since the beginning of mankind an earthquake, and all of a sudden there's going to be an earthquake? You know, you look at those clouds. Have you ever flown through them? You've been in an airplane, you fly through them, and they're thundering? Really? There's nothing to a cloud, really. When you can just drive right through, or take the plane and go right through it. It's a little scary being on there when the lightning is kind of getting close and they finally decide we're going to go up another 5, 7, 8,000 feet to get above the weather. And you get up there and the sun is shining and you just look down and everything else is happening. This guy is in charge of taking care of all that. Now, Raguel, is that how you pronounce it? Anyway, he executes the judgment and vengeance of God. We need to understand that as the church, you and I are not given the permission to revenge against people. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And I used to say, and He's using me. You see? We're going to see here, righteousness always wins. And we need to realize that sometimes we just got to back off and let God take care of it. Because He will in His own time. And let me talk a little more about that when we get done. He is referred to as the friend of God. Then we have the captain of the Lord. I don't know how to pronounce these words, Sarah Gale. In a way, he is the one that changes the spirit of man so he does not sin. He's that really, his job is to really minister to us as individuals, that voice that says, don't do that. That's wrong. Now, we learn things that are wrong. How do we learn? Don't touch it, Mom said. It's hot. What do? We got to touch it. Everybody knows when it's hot, it's not good to touch. Because we've experienced it, and I doubt that anybody in life at all has not touched something that's cold. When I was a kid, you know what the big thing was? Go kiss the flagpole. And that was the interesting thing, because kids would do that, and their lips would stick. And we'd have to go get water and pour on their lips so they could release it. But they would do it. And one kid would do it. And 2 days later, some other kid who just saw what happened would do it. Because that's the way we are. Some things we learn. But you know what? There's always that still small voice that says, don't go that way. And then you find out you didn't go that way, and you find out why. You didn't do this because you found out why. The angels are busy taking care of us and to protect us. Then we have the manifestation of God, which is He's in charge. You know what those angels do? Some of them He's kind of busy. But He records all the good and bad we do. You realize, Christians, that when we get to heaven and the books are opened up, we're going to have our works and the things we did tested by fire. And we're going to get saved. We're not going to lose heaven. We're not going to get out. But what do we have? Did we do anything? Did we do anything for His sake instead of our sake? When this guy, what's really interesting is, when you go to God and you've done something really bad, and you go to God and you go, God, I'm really sorry. God wipes the slate clean as if it was never there. You can come 2 weeks later and say, God, I got this sin. God's going, what sin? You understand what happens? He blots it out. God He forgets. You're not going to stand there in heaven and stand before God and go and say, remember back in January 8th of 1955, you know what you did? I mean, He's got a memory. Think of it, of how many billion people are on this world. Where are we at? 3,807,000,000 people on this world. Almost 4 million. He understands everything. 6 billion. Okay, but He knows. But when it comes to sin, isn't it marvelous to know that we have a Creator who knows we're going to mess up and fail, and yet He wipes it clean. Totally clean. Wow. We can't do that. Because in our finite minds, the devil works a little bit hard. And we remember he did. I pastored a church where we started to grow like mad. People would say, can't let them join the church. Well, back in 1955, I remember it well. It was on a Friday. You know what he did? I don't even know what I did 2 Fridays ago. God doesn't do that. And when He blots this angel, that's what He does. He blots it out. How does it get blotted out? By the blood of Christ. It's all taken care of. Oh, how wonderful that is. Now, Enoch talks about these fallen angels being in groups of 10, 50, and 100. And like I said, we only have the 3 angels that are given names. There are several times in the Bible where it says, now you need to realize that there are a few places in the Bible that was Jesus pre-incarnated. Because it says the angel of the Lord, which is a capital L-O-R-D. That's referring then to Christ as the angel is referred to. There's all kinds of places in the Bible that talks about angels, but doesn't give many names. It just talks about holy beings, angels. Well, here we get the whole list of everything that is going on. And now, the wonderful thing is that we have to remember that what we do is kept track of. You do good, it's kept track of. You do bad, one person told me one time, I'm going to tell you right now, if you look at your life and say, back in whatever year it might be, I remember it well. I gave my heart to Jesus. And I've been a follower of His ever since. And I'm good. You're in trouble. I was talking to a pastor's conference one time. I was the speaker, and this guy in this group said, well, you need to understand that I'm sure the last time I sinned was way back in the 8th grade. Really? I mean, really? You will always find. I'm gonna do a little doctrine. I'm gonna throw in here, okay? You will always find at our church, we never take communion without doing a prayer of forgiveness. I'm a firm believer that Paul talks about those who were falling asleep and all the plain things that they were going through. Is yes, they were coming to have the Lord's Supper, so to speak, but they were getting drunk and doing all kinds of things that was not in common, and he had to straighten that out. But the fact is, who of us can really say, without a doubt, I went all week in sin? Because sometimes our sin is omission of what we didn't do. And I'm not talking about, well, I didn't get drunk, or I didn't do this, or I didn't. God doesn't separate sin into category like we do. We got boxes. We got, the bad ones, and then the not so bad ones, and then these down here. And now in the church today, let's just forget about all these. God doesn't put every sin in a different category. Sin is sin, period. And when you look at the list that he talks about, Paul talks about in 2 Timothy, everything is listed in one paragraph. One paragraph. That's where we get in trouble. Is it okay to say a white lie? Well, I used to say, that's wrong until I got married. Does this dress make me look fat? No, you. And she does. You think really I'm going to answer that question any other way? Not happening! Not happening. I watched my dad be too honest. And he would say to my mother, that is horrible. I mean, he was the sweetest guy you could ever meet, but boy, he was blunt in the house. And it was really surprising to me. Well, what is considered ugly? What is considered fat? We all have a difference of opinion on that, right? But what is it? We're talking about just, well, it's okay. It's not okay. God, you know what? You can go murder somebody and it doesn't look any different in the eyes of God. Ooh, boy, that makes you think about God we have and how it's a little bit different. Now notice here in chapter 9 and verse 2, the archangels, the 7 angels, are talking amongst themselves. And when they talk amongst themselves, they have decided that the cries of these holy people that were being devoured and punished on earth was coming to heaven. The angels see what's going on this earth. Then they got to do something. I want you to know, if you leave tonight with nothing else and totally confused, I want you to leave here with this thought. An earnest prayer never goes unnoticed. Hello? It never does. Now, there are some people who, if you're not right with God, He listens to one prayer, and that's whether you're going to accept Him as your eternal salvation. But the fact is sometimes other people are healed or taken care of because His people are praying. But you need to know that God doesn't come along and say, You know, I don't know how many times I heard people say, my prayers don't even get to the ceiling. Well, you're not praying to the ceiling. Hello? When you get in earnest prayer and pray, the angels are listening. God knows everything. We're going to hear about that in a little bit as the angels talk to God. But the fact is that what's happening is they hear. They know. And if you read the end of Revelations, reckoning day is going to come. And when that comes, they're going to be taken care of and they're going to be punished. And that's the way it's going to end. But I want you to know that you cry out to God in earnestness. God and His angels are listening. Now, the problem is that we say, if He doesn't answer the prayer, you know, I love it. I listen to people pray. They go, dear Jesus, I got this problem. And here's how we can solve it. So can you work it out? Really? You might as well save your breath on that. Because that's not an earnest prayer. An earnest prayer is to live simply say, God, I got this mess. I have no idea how it's going to come out. I don't know what I'm going to do. But you already know. So lead me and guide me. And then let it go. Don't get up from your prayer time and take it back and handle it. And you know, we got the idea that it's always easier to get somebody to say you're sorry than it is to get permission. So sometimes that is really true in human life, that you can do certain things and you'll be forgiven easier than you can get permission. But we take that attitude to God. And then we wonder why everything's a mess. I want to tell you something. If you're going to do it your way and expect God to bless it and get you out of your mess, you're going to have one healthy mess to get through. And just because He didn't work it out the way you said it had to be is no means by saying God isn't interested in me. God sometimes says no, sometimes says yes, and sometimes says you need to wait. Do you know that little verse? I put it down and I can't remember where it is. But 1,000 years to God is like a day. Really? God, I want to be rich. Well, let me think about it for a day. Time is of no essence. When I went on that smuggling trip while I was away, we had no watches, no phones, no nothing. No time zone. I'm in an 8-hour difference, and you know what? It gets dark, and you just do things according to whatever happened. But I don't know. People say, well, how long were you in this Jeep? I don't know. It was a long ride, and it wasn't very comfortable. I thought it was interesting. They strapped the Bible, books of the Bible, the cases of Bibles, they strapped them in the Jeep, and we weren't. It goes to show you what was more valuable was the Bibles than us. But it was I don't know how long it was. But I know it was a lot longer than I had to wait at a store today. I was really frustrated. I went into a store. We do a lot of business there. We just stood at the counter. 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 Well, two of them were over here trying to make a key, and they couldn't make it work. And I don't know how many times they stirred it over. Never said a word to us. Never acknowledged we were even there. Just working on these two keys, and then they do it over. And well, this isn't working. No, that's not to say. I showed Josh the real man of patience. I left everything on the counter and walked out. Now I went to another store and I spent probably longer trying to find what I was looking for than if I had waited where I was at. But we are so bound by time, and God's not. It's not a problem. Now, I want to talk about something that's a no-no in the church, because we're going to find something here that we see in the end of chapter 9. And that is, I don't know how many people say, you don't argue with God. Really? Him and I have had lots of arguments. And I want you to know that that is biblically okay. You say, no, it's not. Oh, yes, it is. Ezekiel 22. God was looking for someone to fill the gap, and he couldn't find a soul. But Ezekiel was standing in the gap, arguing with God. Don't send the punishment. Wait! But there was nobody there. Abraham, Genesis 18. Can you imagine? 75 years old. God says you're moving on. Really? Most of us want to be retired for nothing. And Abraham says, you're going to take your family and you're going to leave. Really? So they leave. And then Lot goes with him, his nephew, and they get in a big argument because there's so many cattle between the two of them and so many people that there wasn't enough food, so they had to get an argument over all the herdsmen. So they split up. And Abraham says, you know what? Go your way. You pick first, and I'll go the other way. And then when God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, what did he do? They said, wait, God, I can find 100. But there wasn't 100. He said, well, wait, God, I can find 50. He couldn't find 20. And he really wound up going down there and rescuing Lot and his 2 daughters, Lot's wife. That was it. But think about it. Little boy in Sunday school says, that's nothing. Lot's wife turned into salt. My mom turned into a telephone pole the other day while she was driving. You know, he couldn't understand how that really happened. But Abraham argued in behalf of his nephew and saying, don't, wait. You remember in Numbers chapter 14? God had it with the Israelites. God said, I am sorry I took them out of Egypt. They haven't followed me. I am going to totally destroy them. And Abraham goes, whoa, you can't do that, God. Then they're going to talk about how you let him get away from the Egyptians, but you let him die out in the wilderness anyway. What's that going to say to all the nations around us? And I love it. Because God says to Abraham these words, I will pardon them according to your word. Job, he's got some wayward kids. In the very first chapter, he talks about giving offerings, burnt offerings, in behalf of these wayward children, in hoping that God would somehow show mercy to them. And he did it. And isn't it interesting that he is pleading before God with these ungodly children? And yet when Satan comes to God and says, I'm going to take it, you know, I can't do nothing. He says, well, you consider Job because he's perfect. How'd you like to have him for a neighbor? He's perfect. And yet he was bargaining, trying to get God to wait on his children until they would listen. Stephen, Acts chapter 7, he's being stoned. And what is Stephen? He's looking up and he says, I see this Jesus sitting on the right hand of God Almighty. And then he makes an amazing statement. He says, God, please don't put a curse on these who are doing it. Really? Paul said in 2 Timothy, when he was writing to that young preacher, he said, you know what? Nobody stood up for me. resume for any church today, he would never get hired. I've been in jail. I've been persecuted. I have been stoned. I've been left for dead. Paul, you just move on. Find another town even. We don't want you. And yet he said, I pray that God will not charge them for that. I think we as a church got it wrong. Don't underestimate the fact that there has to be discipline within the church. And if you do that discipline and guideline and people don't follow it, you have to do things to protect the flock. But you know, one of the things that I never heard in 12 days in Turkey is one person bellyache about anybody in the church. Not one. I was in a group of, I think 650, 700 was the smallest group I had. I had over 1,000 at most. But I went to pastors' meetings afterwards. For 3 hours I'd sit. After 12:30 I'd go sit with these pastors. And I'd say, how's the house church doing? Pastor, tell us a little more about the Holy Spirit. I don't know a thing about house churches in Turkey. I spent 12 days with these people. They didn't tell me one solitary thing about what was going on, how they got organized. They wanted to know, what does the Bible say and teach? And I tell you what, sometimes I think we come together no matter what the church is, and it is just, I think God looks down and says, oh my goodness. Well, we can't argue with God. Him and I have some good arguments. He usually wins in the end, but sometimes I think I win. I think I do. But you know what? I don't think we got a God that's big enough that we understand everything about him. Did not he send Jesus into the world? And you know what? All we think about is Jesus is the fact that he came here to die on a cross and resurrection, and that's our atonement. That is not the case, folks, at all. Yes, that is crucial and important, but he sent Jesus into the world, and for 4 Gospels, we are taught the character of who God is. And yet we don't get it. We don't understand it. I don't like my neighbor. God says, love him anyway. Okay, I will, but he's still not no good. Really? We've been doing a Bible study together, Debbie and I, and that's the wonderful thing about our new job. We got morning study together. That's kind of nice. And by the way, I just want to make this public. I furnished dinner for her last night. I cut up the cheese and the sausage and crackers and got them all in a nice line on the plate. Got them all really nice fresh cup of coffee with whipped cream on the top. But, yeah, I went all out, folks. And there was nothing cooked. It was all in the refrigerator. But I did it because we were having trouble with the internet. We had a lot of things we needed to really get done. And I knew that I could do this little thing. But we have devotions together. And boy, God, I don't like it. I really don't like it. There was a couple of times we got done. She says, you want to do devotion time? No! I don't want to do them now. Because it's really heart-searching. And what the dumb idiot does that wrote the book, he's got 4 questions we're supposed to answer at the end. And my sweet wife, got your questions answered? I don't want to do it. In fact, we just finished a section, and I really feel like before we go to the next section, we got to go back and start through this section again. God go in the corner and suck your thumb. You know? He's got a purpose and a reason that he wants. Yep, it's pouring rain. He's got a reason that he wants us to do, but we're reluctant. If there's anything that we see in this book of Enoch, we're seeing that we are challenged as people, that we have a God that is so great, that is, can you imagine? I was just shocked. This past week, Monday, I raked my yard and cleaned it all up except for one section. There was this little bug, big bug. Kind of strange. Pretty quick. It wasn't there. You know how something begins to play in your mind? You grab my leg, you think something's coming. Guess what, folks? It was the strangest bug I've ever seen. It was a rock. And when I moved my leg, I kicked it over. It was a rock. And I'm petrified. Because it's something I've never seen before. I'm going to bring it to church so you can see it. It's really a weird looking thing. Some animal, you know. You know what? You think God was even concerned about that little thing? I'll bet he was. I bet he laughed at him. Like, oh, it's a rock. Really? Really? This God is so big, so magnificent, that he can speak the world into being and control it. Listen, I was on the bottom side in Australia and we were upright. I don't know how that works. We were upright. The water goes down the drain the other opposite way than ours does. It goes down, but it's like, the world is round. Just a little bit faster, we'd spin off. A little bit slower, we'd fall off. And everybody's all concerned about, oh man, we got this universal earth warming. Why are we all concerned? If we study history and look back far enough, the Antarctic had its coldest year ever on record this year. It's shifting like it always does. From the Arctic to the Antarctic, back to the Arctic. It's done that for centuries. The problem is we're so wasteful. We're worried about things that God's got all taken care of. If we would just use it wisely. He had that all. Do you know, when the angels go to God and say, we know you already know. However, this is what we're hearing. This is what we're seeing. What are you going to do, God? God, a little later, says, I'm going to destroy it all. The flood comes, wipes everything out. And we start over. We start over. With 8 people. And one of them screwed up within the first 2 weeks. Because that's who we are. But God knows that. And he still loves us. No different. No more, no less. He just loves us just the same. Well, folks, that's all we're going to do through chapter 9. We'll pick up chapter 10 next week. I don't know how far we get. I just do 3.5 pages of notes, and I know that that's as far as we're going to get. So thank you for being with us and sharing with us. I know that some of our church people that can't be here at nights are watching it as well. Debbie, if you will take the sheets here and pass them out. They're the notes that are from tonight that I want you to have. Questions?